The Atlanta sky hung low that Tuesday morning, painted in echoes of gray that mirrored the heavy, unspoken scars I now carried in my chest. They say when you lose your husband of 45 years, time stops. But that's a lie. Time doesn't stop. It just becomes incredibly, unbearably loud. Every second ticks against your eardrums, reminding you of the heartbeat that is no longer there. I stood at the edge of the freshly dug earth at Westview Cemetery, my black mourning dress feeling heavier than the humid autumn air pressing down on us. At 68, as a retired head nurse who had spent over 3 decades walking the linoleum halls of Grady Memorial, I thought I understood death. I had held the hands of strangers as they crossed over. I had zipped the bags. I had spoken the words of comfort to wailing widows. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepares you for the moment you are the one staring down into the dark, realizing that half of your soul is in that polished mahogany box. Arthur Sterling was a good man. At least that was the refrain echoing through the crowd of over 200 people gathered around me. He was an elder at Ebenezer Baptist, a man whose baritone voice could shake the stained glass windows when he sang "It Is Well With My Soul." He was the man who proposed to me on a front porch in 1980 with a ring he bought from working double shifts at the auto plant. 45 years of marriage felt like a suddenly closed book, leaving me to balance a faded ledger of memories I wasn't quite ready to audit. A warm, trembling hand slipped into mine. It was Loretta. Loretta Hayes and I had been best friends since we were little girls, with braided hair skinning our knees on the sidewalks of Sweet Auburn. She was a widow herself now, having lost her Henry 5 years ago. She didn't say a word. She just squeezed my fingers, her presence a silent fortress holding me upright when my knees threatened to buckle. "He's at peace, Evie," Loretta finally whispered, her voice rough with her own unshed tears. "Arthur's walking streets of gold now." I nodded, the veil of my hat shielding my eyes. But my gaze wasn't on the casket anymore. It had drifted slightly to my right, to the man standing at the head of the grave. My son, Julian. At 42, Julian Sterling was the undeniable pride of our family. He was the manifestation of every prayer Arthur and I had sent up, the result of every penny we had scraped together to send him to Morehouse, and then on to get his MBA. He stood tall in a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than Arthur's first car. He was striking, carrying his father's broad shoulders, but my sharp, observant eyes. He was the senior vice president of a boutique wealth management firm, a man who navigated the high rises of Buckhead with the same ease he navigated the church aisles. As the pastor recited the final benediction, Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a pristine white handkerchief. He dabbed at his eyes, his shoulders shaking with a perfectly timed, silent sob. A few women in the congregation murmured in sympathy, touched by the sight of the successful, powerful son breaking down over his father's grave. But I was a mother, and I was a nurse. I spent my life reading vital signs, monitoring the microscopic shifts in a person's breathing, the slight tension in a jawline, the subtle dilation of a pupil. I knew the anatomy of genuine pain. Julian's grief was flawless, and that was the problem. It was a performance. As he lowered the handkerchief, I saw the microscopic twitch of his left wrist. He was pulling back his cuff, just a fraction of an inch, to check the face of his heavy gold Rolex watch. It was a split-second movement, practically invisible to the mourning crowd. But to me, it was as loud as a gunshot. He wasn't lost in the agony of saying goodbye to the man who taught him how to ride a bike. He was checking the time. He had somewhere else to be. A sudden, inexplicable chill ran down my spine, cutting right through the thick Atlanta humidity. I forced myself to look away, blaming my exhaustion, my grief, the overwhelming surrealness of the day. "Don't do this, Evie," I silently chastised myself. "Your husband is being lowered into the ground, and you are judging your only child for a nervous tic. He handles millions of dollars. Of course, his mind is distracted." After the service, the repast was held in the fellowship hall of our church. The tables groaned under the weight of casseroles, fried chicken, collard greens, and pound cakes, the edible language of comfort in our community. I sat in a high-backed chair near the front, receiving a seemingly endless line of hugs and whispered condolences. Julian worked the room like a politician at a fundraiser. He held the hands of the elderly church mothers, charming them with his smooth, practiced smile. I watched him approach Mother Jenkins, an 80-year-old woman who had known him since he was in diapers. He leaned in, kissed her wrinkled cheek, and whispered something that made her smile through her tears. "He is such a good boy, Evie. Loretta said, handing me a paper cup of sweet tea. She sat in the folding chair beside me, her eyes following Julian. Arthur was so proud of him. You both raised a king. Thank you, Retta, I murmured, taking the cold cup. He actually called me last week, you know, Loretta added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, pride shining in her eyes. Julian, he's been helping me sort out the money from the house sale. Henry didn't leave much, and with me moving into the assisted living facility, well, Julian said he had a special safe portfolio just for the aunties of the church. He said he'd make sure I'm taken care of. I paused, the rim of the paper cup resting against my bottom lip. Julian had never mentioned managing Loretta's money. In fact, his firm typically had a minimum investment threshold that Loretta, a retired public school cafeteria worker, couldn't possibly meet. He did? I asked, trying to keep my voice light, though a strange tightness had begun to coil in my chest. Oh yes, he handled all the paperwork. Such a blessing, Evie. I don't know what a reverse mortgage or a high-yield bond is, but Julian said I don't need to worry my pretty head about it. Loretta patted my knee affectionately. Arthur's legacy lives on in that boy. I looked across the room. Julian was now standing near the exit, speaking in hushed, urgent tones on his cell phone. His charming smile was gone, replaced by a cold, hardened expression I didn't recognize. He noticed me watching, quickly ended the call, and smoothly slipped his mask of the grieving son back into place before walking over to me. Mama, he said, kneeling beside my chair and taking my hands in his perfectly manicured ones. He smelled of expensive cologne and peppermint. The limo is ready whenever you are. You look exhausted. Let me take you home. I looked into his eyes, the same deep brown eyes he had inherited from me, but where there used to be warmth, I saw only a slick, polished surface, reflecting my own tired face back at me. I'm ready, Julian, I said softly. I didn't know it then, as he gently helped me to my feet and guided me out of the fellowship hall, but the man holding my arm was a stranger, and the home I was returning to was about to become the site of my greatest unraveling. The earth had swallowed my husband that morning, but it was the secrets left behind in his study that were going to bury me. The ride back to our brick ranch house in Cascade Heights was suffocatingly quiet. Julian sat beside me in the back of the town car, his thumbs flying across the screen of his phone. The privacy partition was up, isolating us in a climate-controlled bubble of leather and artificial pine scent. Julian, I said softly, the stiffness of my black collar biting into my neck. You don't have to stay with me tonight, but I'd appreciate it if you came in for a cup of tea. Just to sit for a while. He didn't look up from his screen immediately. When he did, his features shifted into that practiced mask of gentle concern. Mama, you know I'd love nothing more. But the market in Tokyo is opening soon, and with everything going on these past few days, my team is drowning. I need to get back to my condo and log on. I'll have Mrs. Higgins from down the street check on you tomorrow morning. He was outsourcing his grief. He was outsourcing my comfort. I don't need Mrs. Higgins, I replied, my voice flatter than I intended. I've been a nurse for 35 years, Julian. I know how to take my blood pressure and steep a chamomile tea. Go do your work. He kissed my forehead, a dry, obligatory brush of lips, before helping me up the front steps. He waited just long enough to hear the deadbolt click behind me before I heard his dress shoes clicking rapidly down the concrete walkway. The house was not just empty, it was aggressively silent. For 45 years, this space had been a living, breathing entity. It was filled with the low rumble of Arthur's laughter, the smell of his Old Spice lingering in the hallway, the rhythmic squeak of his favorite leather recliner, and the soulful hum of his favorite Mahalia Jackson records on Sunday mornings. Now the air was stagnant. The silence rang in my ears, a high-pitched whine of absolute isolation. I didn't bother changing out of my morning dress. I simply slipped off my black pumps, the cool hardwood floor shocking my tired, swollen feet. I walked aimlessly for a few minutes, touching the backs of chairs, straightening picture frames that were already perfectly aligned. I was a ghost haunting my own life. Eventually, my feet carried me to the last place I wanted to be, yet the only place I felt I needed to go, Arthur's study. It was a small room off the den, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves sagging under the weight of theological commentaries, bound sermons, and history books. The air here was dense, smelling of aged paper, cedarwood, and the faint, sweet trace of the cherry pipe tobacco he had promised me he quit smoking 5 years ago. His reading glasses still sat folded on top of his legal pad. His favorite pen lay right beside them. It looked as though he had just stepped out for a glass of water and would be right back. But my husband had died right here, slumped across this very desk 3 nights ago, his heart failing him in the quiet hours of the morning. I needed to do something with my hands. If I stopped moving, the dam would break, and I wasn't sure I would survive the flood. I grabbed an empty cardboard box from the hall closet and began to pack away the loose papers on his desk. Bulletins, utility bills, drafts for his next Bible study lesson. I reached for the heavy, leather-bound family Bible that sat on the corner of his desk. It was an enormous, intimidating book, passed down from Arthur's grandfather. Its pages held the handwritten records of sterling births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths, stretching back to the 1890s. As I lifted the heavy book to place it in the box, my thumb caught on something sharp along the back cover. I paused, frowning in the dim lamplight. The thick, embossed leather on the inside of the back cover had been meticulously slit open. Arthur was a man who treated books with holy reverence. He would never deface one, least of all the family Bible. My heart began a slow, heavy thumping against my ribs. I set the Bible back on the desk and ran my index finger along the hidden seam. The leather yielded, acting like a small, hidden pocket. I reached inside. The tips of my fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled it out. It was a small brass key, the kind used for a post office box or a secure locker. Tucked behind it, folded into a tight, neat square, was a piece of yellow legal paper. My breath hitched in my throat. I unfolded the paper, the dry rustle sounding deafening in the quiet study. The handwriting was Arthur's, but it lacked his usual bold, sweeping confidence. The ink was shaky, jagged, the words trailing downward as if writing them had physically drained him. Evie, if you are reading this, my heart finally gave out. The Lord knows it's been breaking for a year. Forgive me, my beautiful wife. I was a coward. I thought I could fix it quietly, that I could save our boy without destroying our name. But Julian is lost to us. He took it all. The elders, the widows, protect Loretta. Do not trust him. P.O. Box 412, Downtown Branch. May God have mercy on the Sterling family. The paper fluttered to the mahogany desk, slipping from my trembling fingers. The room suddenly felt completely devoid of oxygen. I sank into Arthur's leather recliner, the worn cushions embracing me as I stared blindly at the brass key. Julian took it all. Loretta's voice from the repast echoed in my mind, sickeningly clear. He said he had a special, safe portfolio just for the aunties. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the recliner as the moon tracked across the floorboards, watching the shadows lengthen and fade. When the first gray light of dawn broke through the blinds, I finally stood up. I didn't feel like a grieving widow anymore. I felt like a detective standing in the middle of a crime scene. My husband's death wasn't just a biological failure. It was the crushing weight of a secret that had literally stopped his heart. By 8 a.m., I was driving my old Buick down Ponce de Leon Avenue toward the downtown post office. The Atlanta traffic was a blur of brake lights and morning commuters, but my focus was entirely on the small brass key burning a hole in my coat pocket. The post office was sterile, smelling of floor wax and stale air. I walked past the sleepy clerks and found the bank of brass-fronted boxes. 410, 411, 412. The key slid in with a smooth, metallic click. I pulled the small door open and retrieved a thick, overstuffed manila envelope. It was heavy, sealed shut with 3 layers of packing tape. I didn't open it there. I walked back to my car, locking the doors before I finally reached into the glove compartment for my nursing scissors. I sliced the top of the envelope and dumped the contents onto the passenger seat. Dozens of bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and legal documents spilled out. I picked up the first stack. They were internal statements from Julian's wealth management firm, but they weren't clean. Arthur had taken a thick black marker and circled specific transactions. There were withdrawals from accounts belonging to names I knew, names I had prayed with. Mother Jenkins, $45,000. Deacon Hayes, $60,000. They were consulting fees and high-risk equity transfers, funneled into a shell corporation registered in Delaware. Julian hadn't just made bad investments. He had deliberately siphoned the life savings of the very people who had watched him grow up. He had weaponized our family's good name to bypass their caution. A wave of nausea washed over me, tasting of copper and bile. My son was a predator. But as I dug deeper into the pile, my horror at Julian's actions was violently eclipsed by a betrayal closer to home. At the bottom of the envelope lay a stiff, cream-colored legal document. It wasn't from Julian's firm. It was from a real estate brokerage in Charleston. My hands shook as I read the heading, Deed of Sale and Title Transfer. It was for the 70 acres of coastal land in South Carolina. That land was the physical soul of the Sterling family. Arthur's great-grandfather, a man born into slavery, had bought that marshland piece by piece after emancipation. It was generationally sacred, a testament to survival, endurance, and black ownership. Arthur used to tell Julian stories about that land, drilling into him that no matter what happened in the world, the Sterlings owned a piece of the earth that nobody could ever take away. I looked at the signature line, Arthur Ezekiel Sterling, dated 11 months ago. Attached to the deed was a cashier's check receipt. Arthur had sold the ancestral land for nearly $600,000, but the money hadn't gone into our retirement. It had been wired directly into Julian's Delaware Shell Company. I sat in the Buick, the engine off, the Georgia morning sun turning the car into an oven, but I was freezing. Arthur knew. My righteous, God-fearing husband had known his son was a thief for almost a year, and instead of holding him accountable, instead of protecting the vulnerable people in our church, Arthur had chosen the Sterling pride. He had sold his grandfather's blood, sweat, and legacy to quietly replace the stolen funds before the authorities or the victims could notice. He had tried to buy Julian's salvation, becoming an accomplice to the crime in the process. He hadn't died of old age. He had died of shame. I stared at the deed, the crisp paper blurring through my tears. The 45 years I spent building a life of integrity with this man felt like a house built on sand. He had left me in the dark, treating me like a fragile woman who couldn't handle the truth, while he slowly suffocated under the weight of their shared sin. And the worst part? Looking at the dates on the most recent fraudulent transfers, Arthur's sacrifice hadn't even worked. Julian had taken the bailout money, and then he had just kept stealing. I picked up Arthur's note again. Protect Loretta. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, the rough fabric of my coat scratching my cheek. The tears stopped. A deep glacial cold settled into my bones, freezing over the grief and leaving only a terrifying, crystal-clear resolve. I was done crying for the men in my family. I started the engine of the Buick, pulling out into the Atlanta traffic. I couldn't trust my husband's memory, and I couldn't trust my son's soul, but I could still save my best friend. It was time to find a lawyer. In our community, there is an unwritten rule, older than the brick and mortar of Ebenezer Baptist itself. What happens in the house, stays in the house. You do not air your dirty laundry for the world to see. You prey on it, you endure it, and you protect the family name at all costs. It was the same toxic, prideful rule that had driven my husband to an early grave. As I parked my Buick outside a repurposed brick warehouse in Atlanta's West End, I realized I was about to break that rule into 1,000 jagged pieces. The frosted glass door read Vance & Associates, Elder Law and Advocacy. I didn't have an appointment. I just pushed the heavy door open, the brass bell above it chiming a bright, cheerful note that felt entirely out of place with the storm raging inside my chest. Nia Vance was 35 now, a razor-sharp attorney with a reputation for chewing up predatory lenders and spitting out their briefcases. But 20 years ago, she was just a terrified, bruised 16-year-old girl sitting on an examination table in my ER, smelling of cheap gin and copper blood after a fight she refused to explain. I hadn't called the police that night. I had stitched her busted lip, held her shaking hand, and marched her directly to our church youth group the following Sunday. I didn't let her out of my sight until she was holding a college acceptance letter. When Nia's secretary buzzed me back, Nia looked up from her mahogany desk. The fierce, professional mask she wore for the world instantly melted. She stood up, her tailored blazer wrinkling as she rushed around the desk to pull me into a deep, lavender-scented embrace. "Miss Evie," she breathed, her voice thick with worry. "I didn't expect you. The funeral? I thought you'd be resting. You shouldn't be driving." "I have rested enough for one lifetime, Nia," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow, stripped of its usual maternal warmth. It was the voice of a woman who had just watched her house burn down and was now standing in the ashes. I didn't sit in the plush client chairs. I walked straight to her desk and upended the heavy manila envelope. The cascade of Arthur's secrets spilled across the polished wood. The Delaware Shell Company filings, the bank transfers, and finally, the deed to the South Carolina land, stamped and finalized. Nia stepped back, her dark eyes darting from the chaotic pile of papers to my rigid posture. "Miss Evie, what is this?" "This," I said, pointing a trembling finger at the deed, "is the price of a sterling man's pride. And this," I swept my hand over the bank statements, "is what my son has been doing to our church." Nia's professional instincts kicked in. The warmth in her eyes was replaced by a cold, calculating focus. She pulled a pair of reading glasses from her breast pocket, sat down, and began to sift through the documents. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the office was the hum of the central air conditioning and the sharp, rhythmic snap of paper being turned. I watched her face. I watched as her brow furrowed, as her lips parted in silent shock, as her jaw tightened into a hard, unforgiving line. It is a terrible thing to watch someone else confirm the monster you birthed. "Evie," Nia finally whispered, dropping a stack of highlighted wire transfers onto the desk. She took off her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Tell me this isn't Julian. Please tell me this is a mistake, a misinterpretation. I was a nurse, Nia. I know how to read a chart. You tell me what the prognosis is." Nia exhaled a long, shaky breath. "He's running a targeted liquidation scheme. He's taking their liquid retirement assets, pensions, home equity payouts, life insurance, and moving them into a high-risk equity fund he controls in Delaware. But it's not an investment fund, Evie. It's a sinkhole. He's paying himself exorbitant management fees. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, while the principal amounts just vanish into offshore LLCs. She picked up the deed to Arthur's ancestral land. And Mr. Arthur, he found out. This cashier's check. He liquidated the family estate to inject capital back into the accounts Julian drained. He was trying to make the victims whole before they noticed the money was missing. "Did it work?" I asked, my voice cracking like dry winter wood. "Did Arthur save them?" Nia looked down at the paperwork, her silence answering me before her words did. "No. It looks like Julian used Arthur's money to pay off a few early investors who got suspicious, to keep them quiet. A classic Ponzi maneuver. Then he just kept draining the rest. Arthur threw a bucket of water onto a forest fire." I closed my eyes. The image of Arthur, sitting alone in his study late at night, clutching his chest as the realization set in that his sacrifice had been completely in vain. He had traded his grandfather's legacy for a lie, and the stress of that failure had stopped his heart. "Look at the names, Nia," I instructed, opening my eyes. The tears were completely gone now, replaced by a dry, burning focus. "Look at who he took from." Nia spread the highlighted statements across the desk. Her eyes scanned the names, and I watched the exact moment the clinical detachment of a lawyer shattered, replaced by the visceral horror of a woman who grew up in the very community being targeted. "Deacon Hayes, Sister Robinson, Mother Jenkins," Nia read aloud, her voice trembling. She looked up at me, the blood draining from her face. "Evie, these aren't just his clients. This is the senior ministry roster. He didn't just find these people, he hunted them. It was the ultimate sacrilege. For a black family in the South, the church is more than a building. It is the sanctuary. It is the place where you are safe from the indignities of the world outside. Arthur was an elder. He held the keys to that sanctuary. Julian had grown up running between the pews, eating pound cake in the fellowship hall, being prayed over by those exact women when he went off to college. Julian hadn't just used his financial acumen. He had weaponized our faith. He had used my 35 years of nursing the sick and Arthur's 40 years of preaching the word as a Trojan horse. He knew these elderly men and women wouldn't question a contract if it was handed to them by Elder Arthur's boy. He had used our name as the ultimate, undeniable guarantee. He knew they wouldn't understand the paperwork, Nia said, her voice dropping to a disgusted whisper. He knew they were too proud to admit they didn't know what a variable annuity was. He just smiled, asked about their grandkids, and handed them a pen. "I need you to stop him, Nia," I said, gripping the edge of her desk so hard my knuckles turned a bruised purple. "I don't care about the family name anymore. I don't care about the scandal. I need you to freeze his accounts. I need you to get their money back." Nia leaned back in her chair, a deep sadness settling over her features. "Evie, it's not that simple. These documents are copies, heavily redacted by Arthur. They prove Arthur knew, and they prove money moved. But Julian is a master at paper trails. These seniors signed legal, binding contracts giving him discretionary control over their assets. In the eyes of the law, they gave him permission to make bad investments. It wasn't a bad investment. It was theft. I slammed my palm on the desk, the sudden violence of the sound making Nia flinch. I know that, and you know that, Nia said gently, reaching across the desk to cover my hand with hers. But to prove fraud on this scale, we need the original unredacted client files. We need to prove malicious intent. Without that, if we go to the authorities right now, Julian's lawyers will tie this up in civil court for a decade. These people are in their 70s and 80s, Evie. They don't have a decade to wait for their money. A heavy, suffocating weight settled over my shoulders. Julian had built a fortress of legal jargon and misplaced trust. He was sitting in his high-rise condo right now, untouchable, while the people who had loved him were quietly bleeding out financially. Then my eyes fell on a specific line item on one of the statements, a name that hadn't fully registered in the chaos of my initial discovery. Loretta Hayes, transfer to Delaware, holding $210,000. My breath stopped. The room spun. $210,000. That was the exact amount Loretta had received from the sale of her modest home last month. It was everything she had in the world. It was the money meant to pay for her room at the assisted living facility, her heart medication, her food for the rest of her natural life. He said he'd make sure I'm taken care of, Loretta had whispered to me at the repast, her eyes shining with pride for my son. Julian hadn't just taken a piece of her pie. He had taken the whole table. He had taken the roof over the head of the woman who used to babysit him, the woman who had stood by my side while they lowered my husband into the dirt. Nia, I choked out, pointing a shaking finger at Loretta's name. This transfer, it's dated 4 days ago. Where is this money right now? Nia quickly typed the holding company's routing number into her secure terminal. She watched the screen for a moment, her face growing grim. It's in a holding state. It hasn't been fully offshored yet. But Evie, it usually clears within a week. Once it leaves the domestic accounts, it's a ghost. We will never get it back. 3 days. I had 3 days before my best friend became entirely, irreversibly destitute. The grieving widow who had walked into this office was gone. The woman who stood up from the mahogany desk was a mother who realized her child had a sickness of the soul that could not be cured, only contained. Prepare the legal filings, Nia. Draft whatever you need to freeze him out, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, absolute calm. I am going to get you the original files. Evie, how? If Julian suspects you know. Julian thinks I am a tired, heartbroken old woman who doesn't know the difference between a mutual fund and a mortgage, I said, buttoning my black morning coat. He thinks I am my husband. He thinks I will suffer in silence. I turned toward the door, the brass bell jingling as I pulled it open. I'm inviting my son over for dinner tonight, and I am going to look the devil in the eye. The drive from Nia's office to the Magnolia Gardens assisted living facility was a blur of gray asphalt and the rhythmic, mocking thump of my tires hitting the pavement. $210,000. The number kept flashing behind my eyelids, a digital countdown to my best friend's ruin. Magnolia Gardens was a respectable place on the east side of town. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, smelling persistently of industrial lemon cleaner and overboiled green beans. I walked down the long carpeted hallway to room 114, my sensible nursing shoes making no sound. I felt like an intruder. I felt like an accomplice. The door was ajar. I pushed it open gently. Loretta was sitting in a floral armchair by the window, the afternoon sun catching the silver streaks in her neatly pressed hair. She was holding a framed photograph of her grandson Marcus in his high school graduation cap and gown. The room was tiny, barely enough space for a twin bed, a dresser, and a small kitchenette, a brutal downgrade from the sprawling 4-bedroom craftsman home she and Henry had built their life in. But she had made it hers, draping her handmade crocheted afghans over the sterile furniture. Evie? She looked up, her face breaking into a wide, luminous smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She set the frame down and reached for her cane. Lord have mercy, what are you doing here? You should be home, resting your spirit. I needed to see a friendly face, Retta, I said. My voice was tight, scraping against my dry throat. I crossed the room and hugged her. She felt frail in my arms, her bones bird-like beneath her soft cardigan. This was the woman who had stood between me and a neighborhood bully in the 5th grade. This was the woman who had stayed up with me for 3 days straight when Julian had pneumonia at age 4, feeding him ice chips while I wept from exhaustion. Sit, she insisted, ushering me toward the only other chair. I was just making some instant tea. It's not your good son tea, but it'll wet your whistle. I sat, my hands clamped together in my lap to stop them from shaking. I watched her move around the tiny kitchenette. She moved slower now, her arthritis acting up with the autumn dampness. I was just looking at Marcus's picture, Loretta said, dropping a tea bag into a ceramic mug. He's starting at Georgia State next month. You know, Evie, I was so worried about how I was going to help him. Henry always wanted to set up a college fund, but the medical bills took so much at the end. She brought the mug over, her hands slightly unsteady, and placed it on the small table between us. But then Julian stepped in, she continued, her voice swelling with a pride that made me physically nauseous. He called me yesterday, Evie. He said the growth portfolio he put my house money into is already yielding dividends. He told me I could write a check for Marcus's first semester tuition, and it wouldn't even touch the principal. He said, Auntie Retta, you just rest easy. I've got the wheel. My stomach bottomed out. Dividends. Julian was feeding her lies disguised as financial jargon. He was encouraging her to write checks against an account that he was currently draining into a Delaware shell corporation. When that tuition check bounced, it wouldn't just be a financial error, it would be a humiliation that would break her proud, generous heart. And in 3 days, when the facility tried to draw her monthly rent from that same empty well, she would be evicted. Retta, I started, the word catching in my throat. I looked down at my hands. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the small table and tear the floral wallpaper down. I wanted to fall to my knees and beg for her forgiveness on behalf of the child I had raised. Tell her, a voice inside me screamed. Warn her. But Nia's legal warning echoed louder. If Julian suspects you know, he'll bury the money forever. I needed the original files. I needed a confession. If I panicked Loretta now, Julian would sense the shift in the wind and vanish the funds offshore with a few keystrokes. I had to let my best friend sit in her blissful ignorance for just a little longer, even if it felt like I was handing her the poison myself. Evie, what is it, honey? Loretta leaned forward, her brow furrowing with concern. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm just tired, I lied, the words tasting like ash. I forced the corners of my mouth up into a fragile, brittle smile. I'm just so grateful you have Julian looking out for you. We are blessed, Evie, she said softly, patting my hand. The Lord took Arthur, but he left you a protector. I left Magnolia Gardens 10 minutes later, barely making it to the Buick before the facade crumbled. I locked the car doors, gripped the steering wheel, and let out a single, ragged, gut-wrenching sob. It wasn't the soft weeping of a widow. It was the primal, violent sound of a mother preparing to go to war against her own flesh and blood. By 4 o'clock, I was back in the kitchen at Cascade Heights. The kitchen had always been my sanctuary. It was where I commanded order. I pulled my heavy cast-iron skillet from the bottom cabinet. The metal was cool and heavy in my hands, grounding me. I was making smothered pork chops, collard greens with smoked turkey neck, and hot water cornbread. It was a heavy, labor-intensive Southern meal. It was also Julian's absolute favorite. It was the meal I made for him when he got his acceptance letter to Morehouse. It was the meal I made when he closed his first $1 million account. Today, it was bait. I stood at the counter, methodically dredging the pork chops in seasoned flour. The repetitive motion, dip, shake, press, was usually meditative. Today, it felt tactical. I dropped the meat into the popping, sizzling oil. The smell of frying flour, seasoned salt, and rendered fat filled the house, chasing away the sterile scent of Arthur's death. I remembered teaching Julian how to cook in this very room. I remembered him pulling a step stool up to the counter, his little hands covered in flour, his big brown eyes looking up at me for approval. "Did I do it right, Mama?" he would ask. Where had that boy gone? How does a child raised on Sunday school lessons, surrounded by a village of aunties and deacons who loved him, grow up to look at those same people and see nothing but prey? Did Arthur and I push him too hard to succeed? Did our pride in his ambition blind us to the rot growing inside his character? I chopped the onions for the gravy, the sharp fumes stinging my eyes, masking the tears I refused to shed. I wasn't cooking with love today. I was laying a snare. To catch a predator, You have to invite him into his natural habitat and make him feel completely in control. At exactly 6:30, the heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded. 3 sharp, confident raps. I wiped my hands on my apron, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked down the hallway. I plastered on the face of Evelyn Sterling, the weary, grieving mother who needed her strong son to hold her up. I opened the door. Julian stood on the porch, bathed in the amber glow of the porch light. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white dress shirt, projecting an image of the hard-working son clocking out to care for his mother. In his left hand, he held a massive bouquet of white lilies. "Hey, Mama," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, comforting baritone. "Julian," I breathed, stepping back to let him in. He wrapped his arms around me. He smelled of expensive scotch and the crisp, artificial air of a high-rise office. I hugged him back, resting my cheek against his chest. I could hear his heartbeat. It was slow, steady. The heartbeat of a man who felt absolutely no guilt for the blood on his hands. "I brought these for you," he said, handing me the lilies as we pulled apart. "I know they were Dad's favorite." "They're beautiful," I said. "Lilies, the flower of funerals, the flower of the dead. How fitting. Come into the kitchen. Dinner is almost ready." He followed me down the hall, tossing his keys onto the credenza. "It smells amazing in here. Smothered chops? Mama, you didn't have to go to all this trouble. I could have ordered us takeout from that Italian place in Buckhead." "Cooking keeps my hands busy," I said, carrying the flowers to the sink. "And I wanted to do something nice for you. You've been carrying such a heavy burden these past few days, Julian. Taking care of all the arrangements, checking in on Arthur's affairs, and taking care of the church folks, too." I watched his reflection in the kitchen window above the sink. He was loosening his silk tie, his posture relaxed, completely at ease in his childhood home. "It's my responsibility, Mama," he said smoothly, pulling out a chair at the kitchen island and sitting down. "Dad left big shoes to fill. I just want to make sure you and the community are protected. It's what he would have wanted." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his words felt like a physical slap across the face. He was sitting in the house his father had mortgaged his soul to save, wearing a watch bought with Loretta's rent money, and daring to invoke Arthur's name. I turned around, the gravy spoon in my hand. I smiled at my son. "I know you do, baby," I said, my voice dripping with maternal warmth. "Now go wash up. Let's sit down and eat. We have a lot to talk about." The trap was set. The predator was at the table. Now the mother just had to pull the wire. The dining room table was a heavy, claw-footed mahogany antique Arthur had bought at an estate sale in the late 80s. It was the geographic center of our family. It was where Julian had learned his multiplication tables, where Arthur had drafted 1,000 Sunday sermons, and where we had bowed our heads in prayer over 3 decades of Thanksgiving turkeys. Tonight, it was a battlefield disguised in fine china and linen napkins. Julian ate with the voracious, unbothered appetite of a man who believed the world belonged to him. The clinking of his silver fork against the porcelain plate was the only sound in the room, save for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He cut into the smothered pork chop, soaking the hot water cornbread in the rich, onion-laced gravy, eating exactly the way he did when he was a growing teenage boy. I sat across from him, a glass of iced sweet tea sweating onto a coaster in front of me. I hadn't touched my plate. My stomach was a tight, twisted knot of adrenaline and revulsion. I watched the muscles in his jaw work as he chewed, studying the handsome, familiar architecture of his face. How did I not see it? I wondered, watching him take a long sip of his tea. When did the boy who used to cry over a stray dog turning into a man who could swallow a widow's life savings without getting indigestion? "Mama, I'm telling you, nobody makes gravy like this," Julian said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. He leaned back in his chair, patting his flat stomach, the picture of a satisfied, dutiful son. "You should have opened a restaurant. You'd have put half the spots in Midtown out of business." "You always did have a big appetite, Julian," I said, my voice quiet, measured. "You always wanted more than what was on your plate." He chuckled, missing the weight of the words. "That's what Dad always said, right? A Sterling man doesn't settle for the scraps. He taught me to be hungry, to build something that lasts." "Is that what you're building, Julian? Something that lasts?" "Of course." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished wood, his eyes shining with that polished corporate earnestness. "Generational wealth, Mama. That's what black folks in this country have been denied for centuries. We get a little piece of the pie, and we hoard it under the mattress. I'm taking our family to the next level. I'm making sure the Sterling name means power in this city long after I'm gone. I reached down into my lap. My fingers closed around the thick manila envelope I had resting on my knees under the table. Your father believed in the Sterling name too, I said smoothly. I pulled the envelope up and laid it flat on the mahogany table, right next to his empty plate. He believed in it so much, he sold his grandfather's blood and sweat to buy it back from the devil. Julian's eyes dropped to the envelope. The charming, relaxed posture didn't immediately vanish. It just froze. For a fraction of a second, the corporate executive processed the anomaly on the table. I didn't wait for him to ask. I reached into the envelope and pulled out the deed to the 70 acres of South Carolina marshland. I slid it across the smooth wood until it stopped inches from his water glass. Next, I pulled out the heavily redacted bank statements, Arthur's jagged black marker circles glaring under the dining room chandelier. I fanned them out like a deck of tarot cards predicting doom. Mother Jenkins, Deacon Hayes, Loretta. Julian stared at the papers. He didn't gasp. He didn't pale. He didn't drop to his knees and beg for his mother's forgiveness. Instead, I watched a horrifying, microscopic transformation take place. The warmth drained out of his brown eyes, replaced by a flat, obsidian coldness. The muscles in his face relaxed into an expression of absolute, calculated emptiness. The son I had raised evaporated into the air, leaving behind a stranger wearing his expensive suit. He calmly reached out with one manicured finger and adjusted the edge of the South Carolina deed so it was perfectly parallel with the edge of the table. "Where did you get these, Evelyn?" he asked. "Not Mama, Evelyn." The sound of my first name in his mouth was a violation, a sharp severing of the maternal cord. "Your father left them for me," I said, keeping my spine rigid, refusing to let him see the tremor in my hands. "He hid them in the family Bible. He sold his legacy to replace the money you stole from our church. He died trying to cover your sins, Julian." Julian let out a slow, measured breath through his nose. He picked up his glass of water, took a sip, and set it down. It was the terrifying calm of a narcissist who had just realized his audience was no longer clapping. "Dad was weak," Julian said, his voice stripped of all its usual melodic warmth. It was flat, clinical. He was a small-minded man who couldn't see the forest for the trees. I told him when he found out. I told him to let me handle it. The market fluctuated. I needed liquidity to cover a margin call on a commercial development in Buckhead. If he had just stayed out of it, the returns would have covered the elder's accounts within 36 months. But he panicked. He sold the land for pennies on the dollar out of some misplaced sense of archaic honor. I stared at him, my mouth slightly parted in sheer disbelief. He wasn't denying it. He was irritated. He was annoyed by his father's morality. "You stole from Loretta," I whispered, the rage finally beginning to burn through the ice in my veins. $210,000. Her home, Julian. She held you when you had pneumonia. She bought your first suit for the homecoming dance, and you took the roof from over her head. "I didn't steal anything," Julian snapped back, a flash of genuine irritation breaking his cold veneer. "She signed a discretionary management agreement. Do you have any idea what inflation does to cash sitting in a low-yield savings account, Evelyn? It rots. I was putting her capital to work." "You put it into a Delaware shell company." I slammed my open palm against the table, making the silverware jump. "You are paying yourself management fees with her rent money. She is going to be evicted in 3 days, Julian. Do you hear me? 3 days. Julian leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me not with guilt, but with a weary, patronizing pity. It was the look a teacher gives a slow student. "This is exactly why black families stay at the bottom of the ladder," he said smoothly. "You and Dad, you think small. You think about next month's rent. I'm thinking about a $10 million real estate portfolio. You have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Those old folks in the church? They were never going to use that money for anything meaningful. They were just going to pass it down to grandkids who would blow it on cars and clothes. I am building an empire with our name on it." "There is no empire," I yelled, the tears finally springing to my eyes, hot and furious. "It's a graveyard. You are building an empire on the backs of the people who prayed for you. You are a predator." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "A predator? No. I'm the only one in this family who actually understands how America works. You don't get a seat at the table by being the good, humble Negro who sings in the choir, Mama. You get a seat at the table by holding the bankroll." He gestured to the papers on the table. "Dad's little investigation is cute, but it's useless. Those are redacted copies. Without the original client files, you have nothing but the ramblings of a dead man and some circumstantial transfers. I am a licensed fiduciary. They signed the risk waivers. The law is on my side." He knew exactly where the legal line was drawn. He had built his trap with meticulous sociopathic precision. "I want the original files, Julian," I said, my voice dropping back to a dangerous, deadly whisper. "I want the files, and I want you to wire Loretta's money back into her account by tomorrow morning. If you do that, I won't go to the police. I will let the church elders handle you quietly." Julian stared at me for a long, heavy moment. The silence in the dining room was absolute, thick with the smell of cold gravy and shattered trust. Then he smiled. It wasn't his charming, public smile. It was a thin, cruel stretching of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. "You're not going to the police, Evelyn," he said, standing up slowly. He towered over me, his broad shoulders blocking the light from the chandelier. "And you're not getting any files." "You don't think I'll do it?" I challenged, tilting my chin up to meet his deadened gaze. "You think because I birthed you, I won't watch you go to prison for what you did to Arthur? For what you're doing to Loretta?" "I know you won't," he said, reaching out and casually plucking his suit jacket from the back of the chair. "Because you are old, you are grieving, and you are exhausted. And quite frankly, you're not thinking clearly." He walked around the table, stopping right behind my chair. I felt the heat radiating off his body, the heavy scent of his cologne suddenly suffocating. He leaned down, his mouth right next to my ear. "I was really hoping we wouldn't have to do it this way, Mama," he whispered, his voice a velvety threat. "But if you try to burn down my life's work for a bunch of old church folks, I'll just have to make sure nobody believes a single word you say." He walked out of the dining room. A few seconds later, the heavy oak front door slammed shut, vibrating the floorboards beneath my feet. I sat alone at the mahogany table, staring at the cold pork chops and the ruined legacy of Arthur Sterling. I had sprung the trap, but I had fundamentally misunderstood the beast I was trying to catch. Julian wasn't a frightened boy caught with his hand in the cookie jar. He was a cornered wolf, and as I would find out the very next morning, the wolf had already bitten first. The smell of cold gravy and congealed cooking fat hung in the kitchen the next morning, a sickening reminder of the trap that had snapped shut on the wrong prey. I hadn't slept. I had spent the night sitting in the dark of the living room, listening to the house settle, waiting for a police car or a sudden knock that never came. Julian's parting words, "I'll just have to make sure nobody believes a single word you say," had echoed against the brick walls of my home until the sun finally breached the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the carpet. By 8 o'clock, the numbness of shock had burned off, leaving behind the sharp, stinging clarity of a nurse entering a trauma bay. Julian was right about one thing. I was exhausted. But he was dead wrong about my clarity. I needed a war chest. Nia was working pro bono right now out of love for me, but fighting Julian in a corporate court would require private investigators, forensic accountants, and filing fees. I also needed to quietly write Loretta a cashier's check from my own savings to cover her rent at Magnolia Gardens before the first of the month, buying us time to find the original files without triggering her eviction. I dressed carefully, a pressed navy blue skirt suit, low sensible heels, and my grandmother's pearl stud earrings. In the South, especially for a black woman of my generation, armor isn't made of steel. It's made of starch, polish, and absolute presentation. You do not go into a battle looking like you have already lost. I drove to the local branch of my bank on Cascade Road. Arthur and I had banked here for 30 years. We knew the tellers' names, their children's graduation dates, and their prayer requests. I walked up to the polished counter and pulled a withdrawal slip from my purse, filling it out for $25,000 from my personal money market account. I slid it across the marble to Denise, a sweet young woman with neat box braids who sang in our church's young adult choir. "Good morning, Miss Evie," Denise said softly, her eyes full of the same sympathetic pity I had been drowning in since the funeral. "We've all been praying for you. How are you holding up?" "Taking it one day at a time, Denise. Thank you," I said, offering a tight, polite smile. "I just need to make a withdrawal this morning." Denise typed my account number into her terminal. I watched her perfectly manicured fingernails clack against the keyboard. Then the rhythmic typing stopped. She frowned, her eyes darting across the glowing screen. She pressed another key. Her brow furrowed deeper. She looked up at me, a flash of genuine confusion crossing her face, before looking back down at the monitor. "Is there a problem, sweetheart?" I asked, my pulse giving a slow, heavy thud. Just a moment, Miss Evie. The system it's throwing a code I haven't seen before. Let me get Mr. Henderson." Denise slid off her stool and hurried toward the glass-walled office at the back of the branch. The air in the bank suddenly felt terribly thin. A low, persistent ringing started in my ears. Marcus Henderson, the branch manager, was a man my age who had played golf with Arthur. He stepped out of his office, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, his face pulled into a mask of deep, agonizing discomfort. He didn't come to the counter. He walked around it, gently touching my elbow. "Evie, why don't you come sit in my office for a moment?" he murmured, his voice pitched low so the other customers couldn't hear. "Marcus, I don't need to sit. I just need my withdrawal. I have errands to run," I said, planting my feet on the carpet. "Evie, please." His eyes pleaded with me. I let him guide me into the small, glass-walled room. He closed the door, shutting out the ambient noise of the bank lobby, amplifying the suffocating silence between us. He walked behind his desk, but didn't sit. He picked up a manila folder, his hands actually trembling. "Evie, I don't know how to say this," Marcus began, looking at the folder instead of my face. "Your accounts, the joint checking, your personal money market, the CDs, they've been frozen, or rather restricted." "Restricted? By whom?" I demanded, my voice rising. "That is my money, Marcus. Arthur is gone, but my name is on every single one of those accounts. I am the primary account holder." "Not anymore." Marcus finally looked up, his eyes filled with a horrific mixture of pity and legal terror. "At 8:05 this morning, Julian's corporate attorney submitted a fully executed, notarized durable power of attorney to our legal department. It was signed by Arthur 3 years ago, during his bypass surgery. It grants Julian full, unmitigated fiduciary control over the Sterling estate in the event of Arthur's death, specifically citing provisions for your care. The room tilted. The leather chair beneath me felt like it was dissolving. Provisions for your care. "Julian moved the funds?" I whispered, my throat so dry the words scraped like sandpaper. "He executed a protective sweep," Marcus said, using the sterile banking terminology that Julian undoubtedly loved. "He transferred the balances into a blind trust. Evie, he removed your signatory access. My hands are tied. Legally, Julian is now the sole authorized representative for your finances. You can't withdraw a single dollar without his signature. My son hadn't just taken the keys to the kingdom. He had changed the locks and left me standing on the street in the dead of winter." "Marcus," I said, leaning forward, pressing my hands flat on his desk to stop the violent shaking that was overtaking my body. "Look at me. Have I ever bounced a check? Have I ever missed a mortgage payment? You know my son is a slick-talking suit. You know he's stealing from me." "Evie, please lower your voice," Marcus hushed, glancing nervously at the glass walls. "I know you're grieving. I know the mind does terrible things when it's drowning in sorrow. Julian warned me you might be confused." The word hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. Confused. Julian hadn't just frozen my money. He had poisoned the well. He had called Marcus, and God knows who else, to plant the seed that Evelyn Sterling was losing her mind. He was framing my legitimate outrage as the paranoid delusions of a grieving, hysterical old woman. "I am not confused," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute stillness. I stood up, smoothing the front of my skirt, though I felt like I was bleeding out on his carpet. "I am being erased, and you are holding the eraser, Marcus." I walked out of the bank with nothing but the lint in my pockets. I didn't cry when I got to the Buick. I couldn't. The magnitude of the betrayal was too massive, too structural, to be washed away with tears. I sat behind the wheel, the Georgia sun baking the interior of the car, and pulled my cell phone from my purse. My hands were stiff, arthritic claws as I dialed Nia's private office line. "Nia Vance," she answered on the first ring, her voice tight and clipped. "He locked me out, Nia," I said, staring blankly at a dead oak tree in the bank parking lot. "He used a power of attorney Arthur signed years ago. He took everything, the savings, the checking. I can't even buy a gallon of milk right now." There was a heavy, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. When Nia spoke, her voice cracked, shedding its professional armor. Miss Evie, I know. I was just about to call you. It's worse than the bank. I closed my eyes. Tell me. 10 minutes ago, a courier dropped a massive legal packet on my receptionist's desk. It's an emergency petition filed in Fulton County Superior Court, Nia said, the rustling of thick paper audible through the speaker. Julian isn't just taking your money, Evie. He's filing for emergency conservatorship and full legal guardianship over you. My breath hitched. A conservatorship. It was the legal equivalent of a death sentence for a living, breathing adult. It meant being stripped of the right to sign a contract, to choose your own doctor, to decide where you live, or to hire your own lawyer. You became, in the eyes of the state of Georgia, a ward, a piece of property to be managed. On what grounds? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He's claiming severe cognitive decline, dementia, and grief-induced psychosis, Nia read, her disgust palpable. He submitted an affidavit claiming you are having paranoid delusions that he is stealing from the church. He used your confrontation at dinner last night as evidence of your escalating volatility and detachment from reality. He even got a doctor, some concierge physician on his firm's payroll, to sign a preliminary assessment agreeing that you are a danger to your own financial and physical well-being. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my fingernails dug half-moons into the faux leather. He was using the truth against me. My accusations were his proof of my insanity. It was a perfect, inescapable sociopathic loop. When is the hearing? I asked. Friday morning, 72 hours, Nia said. It's an ex parte emergency hearing. He requested an expedited docket to protect the estate before you can do further harm to yourself. Evie, if the judge signs this order on Friday, Julian will have the legal authority to force you out of your house. He can put you in a facility. He can literally lock you away. A cold, absolute terror washed over me, a feeling I hadn't experienced since I was a little black girl growing up in the Jim Crow South, realizing that the law was not designed to protect me, but to control me. Julian had spent his life watching me advocate for patients, watching me command a household, watching me be the bedrock of our family. And now he was using the white-collar legal system to systematically dismantle my humanity, brick by brick, just to protect his stolen millions. He thinks I'm going to fold, Nia, I said, opening my eyes. The dead oak tree in front of me suddenly looked less like a corpse and more like a spear pointing at the sky. He thinks because I'm 68, I'll just sit in a rocking chair and let him bury me alive. Evie, we have no money to fight this. He's frozen your assets, and my firm can't legally represent a client who might be declared incompetent without a massive uphill battle. We need proof he's lying. We need the original church files to prove your delusions are actually a massive corporate fraud. We will get them, I said, turning the key in the ignition. The Buick's old engine roared to life, a defiant, guttural sound. How? He's locked you out of his life, his office, his accounts. He forgot one thing, Nia, I said, putting the car into drive. He forgot that I was the one who taught him how to hide things in that house. I'm going back into Arthur's study. I'm tearing it down to the studs if I have to. Julian is arrogant, and arrogant men always leave a trail. Evie, be careful, Nia warned. If he finds out you're digging... I'm his mother, I said, my voice hardening into a blade of pure maternal steel. I brought him into this world, and if I have to, I will drag him out of it. I hung up the phone. The grief was gone. The weeping widow had been officially retired. It was time for the nurse to operate. I didn't drive straight back to Cascade Heights. It was Wednesday afternoon, which meant the Senior Women's Auxiliary was meeting in the basement of Ebenezer Baptist to sort donations for the autumn clothing drive. For 20 years, I had co-chaired that committee. I was a fixture in that basement, smelling of lemon pledge, old paper, and the lavender water the older mothers dabbed on their wrists. I needed to see the battlefield. I needed to see exactly how far Julian's poison had spread. I parked the Buick and walked down the concrete steps to the fellowship hall. The heavy wooden door creaked open, announcing my arrival. Usually this sound was met with a chorus of warm greetings. Hey there, Sister Evie, we saved you a seat. Today, the room went dead silent. A dozen women whose children I had nursed through fevers, whose hands I had held during miscarriages, froze over their piles of folded sweaters. The air grew instantly thick, suffocatingly heavy. No one smiled. A few women abruptly looked down, suddenly intensely interested in the lint on the clothing in front of them. Mother Jenkins, the 80-year-old matriarch who had practically helped raise Julian, was sitting near the coffee urn. When our eyes met, she didn't offer her usual bright, toothy grin. Her face crumpled into an expression of profound, agonizing pity. That pity was a physical blow. It hurt worse than the silence. "Evie, sweetheart," Sister Robinson murmured, finally breaking the quiet. She took a tentative step toward me, treating me the way one might approach a frightened, unpredictable animal. "What are you doing here? Julian said the doctor wanted you on bed rest. He said the stress of the funeral had caused a bit of an episode." An episode, the clinical, sanitized word for losing your mind. Julian hadn't just spoken to the bank manager. He had weaponized my sanctuary. "I am fine, Sister Robinson," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room, steady and resonant. "I don't need bed rest. I came to help with the sorting." I walked toward my usual chair at the head of the folding table. As I approached, two women subtly shifted away, leaving a wide, isolating gap around me. It was the physical manifestation of the conservatorship. They were already mourning my mind, burying me while I was still standing right in front of them. Just then, the heavy footsteps of Pastor Thomas echoed on the basement stairs. He descended rapidly, his face a mask of pastoral concern. He was a younger man, in his late 40s, who relied heavily on Julian's financial guidance for the church's building fund. "Mother Evie," Pastor Thomas said, bypassing the other women and coming straight to me. He placed a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder. "Brother Julian just called my office. He was frantic, Evie. He said you took the car and slipped out while he was trying to fill your new prescriptions." "I don't have any new prescriptions, Pastor," I said, looking him dead in the eye, refusing to shrink under his heavy hand. "Julian is lying to you. He has stolen from this congregation, and he is trying to lock me away so I can't prove it." A collective, sharp intake of breath sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. Mother Jenkins pressed a hand to her chest. Pastor Thomas's face tightened. The patronizing concern hardened into a look of weary embarrassment. He lowered his voice, leaning in close so only I could hear. "Evie, please, don't do this here. Julian warned us the paranoia was focusing on him and the church finances. He's carrying a terrible cross right now, trying to honor Arthur's memory while caring for your decline. Let me drive you home. Let's not make a scene in front of the sisters." He warned us the paranoia was focusing on him. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Julian had anticipated my every move. He had built a preemptive narrative so flawless, so perfectly tailored to the biases of a community that respected him, that the truth sounded exactly like the ravings of a madwoman. If I screamed, I was hysterical. If I accused him, I was paranoid. If I fought back, I was combative. I looked around the room. I saw the fear in their eyes. I saw the absolute refusal to believe that the sharp, handsome boy who had grown up in their Sunday school could be a monster. They needed me to be crazy, because the alternative, that their life savings were gone and their trust had been weaponized, was too devastating to bear. I slowly removed Pastor Thomas's hand from my shoulder. "I can drive myself, Pastor," I said quietly, the ice returning to my veins. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I simply turned my back on the women who had been my sisters for 40 years, walked up the concrete stairs, and left the church. They thought they were watching a tragedy. They didn't know they were watching an eviction. I had been cast out. The drive back to Cascade Heights was solitary, the silence in the car ringing with the finality of what had just happened. I had 70 hours until a judge would look at Julian's affidavit, look at the testimony of my pastor and my bank manager, and slam the gavel down on my life. I unlocked the front door of my house. The space that had felt suffocatingly empty the night before now felt like a ticking time bomb. It was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, and I was the lead investigator. I didn't bother changing my clothes. I walked straight into Arthur's study, closed the heavy oak door behind me, and locked it. I stood in the center of the room, inhaling the scent of cherry tobacco and old paper. Julian had grown up in this house. He knew where the spare keys were kept. He knew about the loose floorboard in the attic, and he knew Arthur's hiding spots. If the original files were here, they wouldn't be in a desk drawer or a filing cabinet. They would be somewhere Julian would never think to look, or somewhere Arthur had guarded with his life. I am a nurse. I know how to dissect. I know how to peel back the layers of skin and muscle to find the rot underneath. I started with the bookshelves, hundreds of theological volumes. I pulled them down one by one, shaking them by the spine, listening for the flutter of hidden paper. I checked the top edges of the door frames. I pulled the heavy Persian rug back, my arthritic knees screaming in protest as I crawled along the hardwood, feeling for any uneven planks. Hours bled away. The afternoon sun shifted across the room, turning from a harsh, bright yellow to a deep, bruised purple. Dust motes danced in the fading light, mocking my frantic, fruitless search. My skirt suit was covered in dust. My pantyhose were snagged. I sat back on my heels, wiping the sweat from my forehead with a trembling hand. Nothing. There was nothing here. Despair, cold and heavy, began to seep into my chest. Julian had won. He had outsmarted his father, and now he was going to bury his mother. The sheer, terrifying weight of the conservatorship loomed over me. In 3 days, strangers would come to pack my bags. Julian would sell this house, liquidate my accounts, and pay for his Delaware shell companies with the remnants of my life. I looked at Arthur's heavy mahogany desk. His reading glasses were still there. "Why did you leave me in the dark, Arthur?" I thought, a bitter sob finally tearing its way out of my throat. "If you knew he was a devil, why didn't you leave me a sword?" I pulled myself up, leaning heavily against the desk. My hand brushed against the ornate antique wooden humidor sitting near the brass lamp. Arthur had stopped smoking his pipe years ago, but he had kept the humidor. My nursing instincts, the ones that noticed the slight change in a patient's breathing, the subtle shift in a heart monitor, suddenly flared. Arthur had kept the humidor, but he didn't use it for cigars. He used it for his medication. Arthur was a man of intense, almost neurotic routine, especially after his bypass surgery. He took his lisinopril, his statin, and his baby aspirin at exactly 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. He never missed a dose. He organized them in the humidor because he liked the dignity of the heavy wooden box over cheap plastic pill organizers. Julian knew this. Julian also knew that Arthur's heart condition was his most vulnerable point. It was the one area of Arthur's life that Julian, with all his arrogance, found distasteful and avoided discussing. Sickness repulsed Julian. He only respected strength. I stared at the humidor. The polished mahogany gleamed in the dim light. I reached out and popped the brass latch. The lid lifted smoothly. Inside, sitting on the cedar lining, were 3 orange plastic pill bottles, the last remnants of my husband's failing heart. I took the bottles out, setting them on the desk. The box was empty. But as I looked at the cedar floor of the humidor, something felt wrong. The depth. The outside of the box was nearly 5 inches tall, but the inside compartment only looked to be about 3 inches deep. I pressed my thumbs against the cedar floor. It didn't budge. I ran my fingernail along the edges. The seam was incredibly tight, flawless woodwork. I grabbed Arthur's metal letter opener from the desk drawer and wedged the sharp tip into the back corner of the cedar lining. I pushed down. The wood gave a sharp crack. I wedged the blade deeper and pried upward. The false bottom of the humidor popped loose, flipping over onto the desk. My breath caught in my throat. Hidden in the secret compartment wasn't a stack of paper. It wasn't the original client files. It was a small, black, voice-activated microcassette recorder, the kind Arthur used to use to dictate the rough drafts of his sermons before he bought a computer. I picked it up. The plastic felt cold and heavy in my palm. Through the small, clear window on the front, I could see a microcassette loaded inside. The magnetic tape was wound almost completely to one side. It had been used. Arthur hadn't just left me bank statements. He had left me a voice. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the device. I fumbled with the small buttons on the side, finding the playback switch. I sank into Arthur's leather recliner, the silence of the study pressing in on me from all sides, a heavy, suffocating blanket. I pressed play. For 3 seconds there was nothing but the harsh analog hiss of static. Then Arthur's voice filled the room. It wasn't his booming pulpit voice. It was a ragged, wet, terrifying wheeze. It was the sound of a man fighting for air, the sound of a heart physically giving out. "Julian, please." Arthur's recorded voice gasped, the audio clipping slightly from how close he was to the microphone. "My pills. The humidor. Please, son." I froze, the blood turning to ice water in my veins. This wasn't a confession about the church funds. This was a recording of the night Arthur died. Then another voice answered. Smooth, calm, deadly. "I told you to let me handle the accounts, Dad. I told you what would happen if you interfered." It was Julian. "My chest," Arthur groaned, the sound accompanied by a heavy thud, as if he had collapsed against the desk. "Call 911, Julian, I can't breathe." "You sold the South Carolina land behind my back," Julian's voice replied, terrifyingly even, devoid of any panic or urgency. "You tried to bankrupt my firm to pay back a bunch of irrelevant old people. You broke our family, Dad, not me." "Son, please." The gasp was weaker now, a horrible, wet, rattling sound. "I can't let you talk to the elders tomorrow, Dad," Julian said. I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps backing away from the microphone. "The estate automatically transfers to my control if you're gone. It's the only way to protect the portfolio. I'm sorry. You just didn't have the vision." "Julian!" It was a final, desperate, gurgling cry. Then there was only the sound of Arthur's ragged, agonizing breathing. It slowed, and then there was a final, heavy exhalation, followed by the terrifying, absolute silence of death. 30 seconds of dead air passed on the tape before I heard Julian's footsteps return. I heard him pick up the phone on the desk. "Yes, 911? Julian's recorded voice suddenly shifted, cracking with a perfectly executed hysterical panic. "Please, you have to send an ambulance. It's my father. I just walked into his study and he's on the floor. I think he's having a heart attack. Please hurry." The tape clicked and the playback stopped. The silence in the study was deafening. I sat in the recliner, the microcassette recorder gripped so tightly in my hand that the plastic creaked. My husband hadn't just died of a broken heart. My son had watched him die. He had stood in this exact room, watching the man who gave him his name suffocate, calculating the financial benefits of his death, and refusing to hand him the pills that were sitting mere inches away. Julian was not just a thief. He was a murderer. The tears I hadn't been able to shed finally came, but they weren't tears of grief. They were boiling, acidic drops of pure, unadulterated fury. The mother inside me, the woman who had nurtured, protected, and loved Julian Sterling, finally, permanently died. I didn't need the original client files anymore to stop a conservatorship. I had a confession to homicide. I stood up, slipping the recorder into the deep pocket of my suit jacket. The 72-hour countdown hadn't been a timeline for my destruction. It had been a countdown to Julian's execution. I walked out of the study and picked up the phone to call Nia Vance. We were going to war. The drive back to the West End felt different this time. The crushing, suffocating weight that had pressed against my chest since the moment Arthur's casket was lowered into the ground was gone. In its place was a terrifying, hollow clarity. The city of Atlanta flashed by my windows, the neon signs, the brake lights, the towering glass facades of Buckhead where Julian sat in his corner office, but it all looked like a stage set. The only real thing in the world was the cold plastic of the microcassette recorder burning against my thigh in the pocket of my skirt. It was past 7 o'clock when I pulled up to Nia's office. The front door was locked, the closed sign flipped outward. I knocked hard on the frosted glass. A moment later, the deadbolt slid back, and Nia stood there in her stocking feet, a half-eaten salad in one hand and a thick legal binder in the other. She took one look at my face and stepped aside. "Evie, you shouldn't be driving in the dark," she said, locking the door behind me. "I was just drafting a motion to request a delay on the hearing. I'm trying to argue that 72 hours is a violation of your due process, but the judge on the docket is Judge Harmon. He's old school, strictly by the book, and Julian's lawyers have padded that affidavit with so much medical jargon." "Stop typing, Nia," I said, walking past her toward the inner office. "We don't need a delay." I stepped into her office, the smell of stale coffee and laser printer toner hanging in the air, and placed the microcassette recorder squarely in the center of her mahogany desk. Nia followed me in, setting her salad down. She looked at the small black device, then up at me. "What is that?" "It's the reason Arthur died," I said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. My spine was perfectly straight. "I found it hidden under a false bottom in his humidor. Arthur used it to dictate his sermons. He must have clicked it on when Julian came into the study that night, hoping to catch him admitting to the church fraud." "And did he?" Nia asked, her voice dropping, sensing the absolute gravity in the room. "He caught something much worse. Press play." Nia reached out, her manicured finger hesitating for a fraction of a second before pressing the button. The analog hiss filled the quiet office. Then came the terrible, wet sound of Arthur fighting for breath. Nia's eyes widened. When Julian's smooth, icy voice cut through the static, I told you what would happen if you interfered. Nia literally recoiled, her hand flying to cover her mouth. I didn't flinch. I had already shed my tears in the study. I simply watched my lawyer process the reality that the polished, successful man she had known her entire life was a sociopath. When the tape clicked off, the silence was so profound it rang in my ears. Nia stared at the recorder, her chest heaving, her eyes shining with unshed tears of pure horror. "He let him die," Nia whispered, her voice trembling. "Evie." He stood there and watched his own father suffocate. He withheld his medication. "And then he picked up the phone and cried for the 911 operator," I added, my voice like crushed glass. "He needed Arthur dead so the estate would default to his control. It was the only way to cover the theft from Loretta and the church." Nia bolted out of her chair and began pacing the small office, her legal mind rapidly shifting gears from civil defense to criminal prosecution. "This is felony murder, Evie. Depraved heart murder at the very least. We need to go to the Atlanta Police Department right now. We need to hand this over to a homicide detective." "No," I said sharply. Nia stopped pacing and stared at me as if I had spoken in tongues. "Evie, what are you talking about? Your son is a murderer. He is a flight risk with millions of dollars sitting in offshore holding accounts." "If we go to the police tonight, what happens?" I asked, leaning forward. "Julian gets arrested. Before sunrise, his firm's fixers and his high-priced defense attorneys will have him out on bail. They will immediately file an injunction to suppress this tape, claiming Arthur was delirious, or that the audio was doctored, or that I doctored it because of my dementia. Meanwhile, the conservatorship hearing on Friday will either proceed or Julian will use the chaos to fully liquidate the Delaware accounts and erase Loretta's money forever." Nia slowly sank back into her chair, realizing I was right. In the justice system, money doesn't just buy a defense, it buys time. And time was the one thing Loretta didn't have. "He built a trap to lock me away on Friday morning," I continued, tapping my index finger on the desk. "He is going to walk into that courtroom wearing his custom suit, looking like the grieving, exhausted son. He wants a judge to formally declare me insane so he can take my house and my voice. We are going to let him." "You want to play the tape at the conservatorship hearing?" Nia realized, a fierce, predatory gleam entering her dark eyes. "I want the judge who holds my freedom in his hands to hear exactly who is asking for the keys," I said. "And I want it on the judicial record, under oath, in a civil court where Julian's criminal defense lawyers won't be sitting next to him to object. I want to shatter him, Nia. I want to blindside him so completely that he doesn't have time to move a single dime before the FBI slaps the cuffs on him." Nia nodded slowly, a dark smile touching the corners of her mouth. "An ex parte hearing allows for the presentation of emergency evidence to establish the mental capacity and immediate danger to the ward. We can enter it as evidence of his unfitness to serve as a conservator. The moment Judge Harmon hears that tape, he won't just throw out the petition. He'll order the bailiffs to detain Julian and immediately refer the case to the district attorney." "There is one more thing," I said, the adrenaline momentarily fading, leaving me with the grinding anxiety of reality. "Loretta's rent is due tomorrow. Magnolia Gardens processes their checks on the 1st. If it bounces, they will issue a 30-day notice, and the humiliation will kill her before her heart does. Julian froze my accounts. I can't pay it." Nia reached for her checkbook, pulling it from the top drawer of her desk. "How much is the monthly rent?" $4,200. She wrote the check with swift, decisive strokes, tore it from the ledger, and slid it across the desk. "Consider it an advance on the settlement we are going to wring out of Julian's firm for failing to oversee their broker. I'll drop it off at the facility's front office myself tomorrow morning." I looked at the check, a wave of profound gratitude washing over me. "Thank you, Nia, for believing me." "Miss Evie," she said softly, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "You saved my life when I was 16. I'm just returning the favor." Thursday was an agonizing exercise in endurance. I stayed inside the house in Cascade Heights. The phone didn't ring. Not once. No casseroles were dropped off on the front porch. The women of Ebenezer Baptist had drawn their line in the sand, opting for the comfort of Julian's lies over the messy, terrifying reality of my truth. I spent the day walking through the rooms of my home. I touched the floral wallpaper in the guest bedroom. I ran my hands over the worn upholstery of the living room sofa. I looked at the framed photographs lining the hallway. Julian in his Little League uniform, Julian graduating from Morehouse, Arthur and I cutting our silver anniversary cake. It felt like walking through a museum dedicated to a civilization that had collapsed overnight. I realized with a heavy, settling peace that I could never live in this house again. Even if we stopped the conservatorship, even if Julian went to prison, the walls of this house were poisoned. Arthur had financed this life with the blood of his ancestors and the betrayal of his flock. Julian had stained it with murder. It was just wood and brick now. That evening, I packed a single, small leather overnight bag, a few changes of clothes, my nursing certificates, my mother's Bible, and a framed photo of me and Loretta from a church picnic in 1985. I set it by the front door. I wasn't just preparing for court. I was preparing to leave the life of Evelyn Sterling behind. Friday morning broke with a crisp, biting chill. The sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. I dressed in my armor, a charcoal gray suit, impeccably tailored, a string of pearls. My hair was perfectly pressed and pinned. I looked exactly like the dignified, sharp-minded head nurse who had run the ER for 3 decades. I looked nothing like the frail, psychotic widow Julian had described in his legal filings. At 8 a.m., Nia pulled up in her sleek black sedan. I locked the front door of Cascade Heights, didn't look back, and got into the passenger seat. "Are you ready, Miss Evie?" Nia asked, the engine idling smoothly. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the hard plastic edge of the microcassette recorder. I thought of Arthur, suffocating in the dark. I thought of Loretta, staring proudly at a photograph of a grandson she thought she could help. "Take me to the courthouse, Nia," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Let's go slay a giant." The Fulton County Courthouse is a monolithic structure of concrete and glass that smells perpetually of floor wax, stale coffee, and quiet desperation. As Nia and I walked through the metal detectors, I felt the heavy institutional coldness of the building seep through the soles of my sensible pumps. For most people, this building was a labyrinth of intimidating rules. For me, after 35 years of navigating hospital bureaucracies, charting patient codes, and staring down arrogant surgeons, it was just another sterile room where life and death were reduced to paperwork. We took the elevator to the 4th floor, courtroom 4B. When Nia pushed open the heavy double doors, the air inside was thick and hushed. Judge Robert Harmon sat high on the mahogany bench, a man in his late 60s with a face carved from granite and a reputation for strict, unyielding adherence to the law. Sitting at the petitioner's table was my son. Julian wore a navy blue suit, subdued, respectful, the exact attire of a man carrying a heavy, tragic burden. Sitting beside him was Richard Caldwell, a silver-haired corporate litigator whose hourly rate probably equaled my annual pension. As Nia and I walked down the center aisle to the respondent's table, Julian turned his head. He looked at me with an expression of such profound, agonizing pity that it nearly took my breath away. It was a masterpiece of emotional forgery. But underneath the furrowed brow and the sorrowful eyes, I saw the microscopic, terrifying gleam of absolute triumph. He thought I was a lamb walking to the slaughter. I sat down next to Nia, keeping my back straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The heavy leather purse at my feet held the microcassette recorder. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. Judge Harmon adjusted his reading glasses, looking down at the thick stack of papers Julian's lawyer had filed. "We are here for an emergency ex parte hearing regarding the petition for conservatorship and permanent guardianship of Evelyn Sterling. Mr. Caldwell, you represent the petitioner, Julian Sterling. Proceed." Caldwell stood, buttoning his suit jacket. He had a smooth, honeyed southern drawl that made his words sound like a gentle lullaby, masking the lethal intent behind them. "Thank you, Your Honor," Caldwell began, his voice dripping with synthetic empathy. "This is a tragic day for the Sterling family. My client stands before you not to take from his mother, but to protect her from herself. Evelyn Sterling has dedicated her life to nursing others. But the sudden traumatic loss of her husband of 45 years has triggered a severe, precipitous cognitive decline. I sat perfectly still. I didn't shake my head. I didn't scowl. I listened to a stranger clinically dissect my mind and feed it to the court. Mrs. Sterling has developed acute grief-induced psychosis, manifesting in severe paranoid delusions, Caldwell continued, pacing slowly in front of his table. She has become convinced that my client, a highly respected fiduciary in this city, is engaged in a massive systemic fraud against their church community. She has accosted him in his home. She has wandered out of the house in a state of deep confusion. We have submitted an affidavit from Dr. Eris Thorne, a board-certified neurologist, concurring that Mrs. Sterling is an immediate danger to her own financial and physical well-being. Caldwell paused, turning to look at me with a tragic sigh. Your Honor, if she is left in control of the Sterling estate, we fear she will liquidate her assets in her paranoid state, leaving herself destitute. My client simply wants the legal authority to manage her care, to ensure she is placed in a facility equipped to handle her decline, and to protect the legacy her late husband worked so hard to build. It was flawless. It was a watertight narrative, built on the inherent societal bias that older women, especially grieving widows, are fragile and prone to hysteria. Judge Harmon looked over the rim of his glasses at Naya. Counselor Vance, I must admit the medical affidavits and the testimonies from her own pastor paint a very concerning picture. What does your client have to say to these claims? Nia stood up. She didn't have a thick binder. She didn't have a honeyed drawl. She had the razor-sharp posture of a woman who had clawed her way up from the West End, and the absolute, terrifying conviction of the truth. Your Honor, Nia said, her voice ringing clear and hard against the wood-paneled walls. My client does not suffer from paranoia. She suffers from the devastating burden of being right. Caldwell scoffed loudly. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is engaging in theatrics. Overruled. Let her speak, Mr. Caldwell, Harmon said, leaning forward. Julian Sterling did not file this petition to protect his mother's health, Naya continued, stepping out from behind our table. He filed this petition to execute a hostile takeover of her finances, and more importantly, to legally silence the only witness to his crimes. If he can have her declared legally incompetent today, any report she makes to the authorities regarding his massive financial fraud will be dismissed as the ramblings of a sick woman. Your Honor, this is outrageous, Caldwell yelled, slamming his hand on the table. These are the exact delusions we detailed in our filing. Counsel is simply parroting her client's psychosis. I am parroting evidence, Mr. Caldwell, Naya snapped back, her eyes flashing. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, in a conservatorship hearing, the court must evaluate the fitness of the proposed conservator. I have physical evidence, obtained legally from the residence of the deceased, that proves Julian Sterling is not only unfit to manage his mother's estate, but that he is an active, immediate threat to her life. Julian's posture shifted. The microscopic gleam of triumph in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden, rigid tension. He looked at my leather purse. That is a very heavy accusation, Ms. Vance, Judge Harmon said, his voice dropping an octave. You are bordering on defamation of a licensed fiduciary. What evidence? Nia walked back to our table. I unclasped my purse, reached inside, and pulled out the small black microcassette recorder. I handed it to Nia. Exhibit A, Your Honor, Naya said, holding the plastic device up. A voice-activated recording made by the late Arthur Sterling in his private study on the night of his death. Arthur used this to dictate his sermons. It captured his final moments. Caldwell rushed forward. Objection. We have no verification of this tape's authenticity. It has no chain of custody. It is completely inadmissible in a civil hearing. Your Honor, this is an ex parte emergency hearing, Nia countered smoothly, quoting the exact procedural loophole we had banked on. Hearsay and emergency evidence are admissible at the judge's discretion to establish immediate danger. If this court is being asked to strip Evelyn Sterling of her human rights based on Julian Sterling's character, you must hear what Arthur Sterling captured on this tape. Judge Harmon stared at the small black device. He looked at Julian, whose face had suddenly drained of all color, taking on the waxy gray pallor of a corpse. Bring it to the bench, Ms. Vance, Harmon commanded. Nia carried the recorder to the clerk, who plugged a small auxiliary cord from the device into the courtroom's public address system. The silence in courtroom 4B was absolute. You could hear the hum of the HVAC unit. You could hear the squeak of the bailiff's leather belt. I looked directly at Julian. I didn't blink. I wanted to see the exact moment his empire burned to the ground. Naya pressed play. The harsh analog hiss of static filled the courtroom, echoing off the high ceilings. Then came the terrible, wet, ragged sound of Arthur fighting for breath. I saw Judge Harmon flinch. Caldwell's brow furrowed in confusion. Julian, please! Arthur's gasping voice vibrated through the speakers, a ghost haunting the courtroom. My pills. The humidor. Please, son. Julian grabbed the edge of his table. His knuckles turned bone white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I told you to let me handle the accounts, Dad. I told you what would happen if you interfered." The sound of Julian's recorded voice, cold, venomous, utterly devoid of empathy, hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. Caldwell, the high-priced corporate shark, physically took a step away from his own client. The court reporter's hand stopped hovering over her stenograph machine, frozen in midair. "My chest," Arthur groaned on the tape, followed by the heavy thud of his body hitting the desk. "Call 911. Julian, I can't breathe." "You sold the South Carolina land behind my back," the recorded Julian said, his footsteps echoing as he backed away from his dying father. "You tried to bankrupt my firm to pay back a bunch of irrelevant old people. You broke our family, Dad, not me." Judge Harmon's face turned a mottled, furious red. He looked at Julian with an expression of absolute, unadulterated revulsion. "I can't let you talk to the elders tomorrow, Dad," the tape continued, merciless and damning. "The estate automatically transfers to my control if you're gone. It's the only way to protect the portfolio. I'm sorry, you just didn't have the vision." The final wet death rattle echoed through the speakers. The 30 seconds of dead air that followed felt like an eternity. And then the final sickening nail in the coffin. "Yes? 911? Julian's recorded voice shrieked, executing his flawless hysterical panic. "Please, you have to send an ambulance. It's my father. I think he's having a heart attack." Nia reached over and pressed stop. The click of the button severed the tension in the room like a guillotine. Julian sprang from his chair. The polished executive was gone, replaced by a cornered, frantic animal. "That's doctored," he screamed, his voice cracking, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She made that up. She spliced it. I wasn't in the room. I was in the kitchen." "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Harmon said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, lethal gravity that cut right through Julian's screaming. "Control your client." Caldwell looked at Julian, then looked up at the judge. The lawyer slowly raised his hands and took another step back, effectively abandoning his client in open court. "Your Honor, I had no knowledge of this audio. Petition for conservatorship is denied with extreme prejudice," Judge Harmon snapped, slamming his gavel down with a crack that made Julian jump. Harmon pointed a finger directly at Julian. "Bailiff, detain Mr. Sterling. Do not let him leave this room." 2 armed bailiffs moved with terrifying speed, stepping up behind Julian. "No! You can't do this!" Julian thrashed, his custom suit pulling at the seams as one of the bailiffs grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. "I'm a licensed fiduciary. My mother is insane. She's crazy." Click, click. The sound of cold steel handcuffs locking around my son's wrists was the heaviest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of my bloodline ending. It was the sound of justice, and it was the sound of my absolute failure as a mother, all wrapped into one metallic snap. As the bailiffs yanked him backward, Julian's eyes locked onto mine. The arrogance was completely burned away, leaving only raw, naked terror. For a fleeting, agonizing second, I didn't see the sociopath who had let my husband suffocate. I saw the 4-year-old boy who had looked up at me from his step-stool in the kitchen, asking if he had done it right. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply looked at the monster he had chosen to become, and I let him see that the mother who would have died for him was no longer there. "Take him to the holding cells," Judge Harmon ordered, disgust lacing every syllable. "And have the clerk contact the Fulton County District Attorney's Office immediately. Tell them we have a suspect in custody for homicide, and I am personally referring this to the White Collar Division for immediate asset freezes." Julian was dragged backward through the heavy oak doors, his frantic screams echoing down the marble hallway until the doors swung shut, cutting him off completely. The courtroom fell silent again. Nia let out a long, shaky breath, sinking into her chair, her hands trembling as the adrenaline finally crashed. Judge Harmon took off his glasses and looked down at me. The harshness in his eyes had softened into a deep, respectful sorrow. "Mrs. Sterling," he said gently, "the court apologizes for what you have had to endure today. You are a very brave woman." "Thank you, Your Honor," I said quietly. I had won. I had kept my mind. I had kept my freedom. I had put the devil in a cage. But as Nia and I walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding Atlanta sun, the victory tasted like ash in my mouth. Julian was going to prison for murder, but the Delaware holding accounts were still a tangled web of corporate shielding. Loretta's money, the church's money, the blood of Arthur's legacy, it was all still gone. I had stopped the bleeding, but I hadn't saved the patient, and I knew with the crushing weight of a nurse who refuses to give up on the dying that I still had one final, agonizing incision to make. Would you like me to continue with Part 10, the final chapter, where Evie makes the ultimate sacrifice to save Loretta and the church, and experiences the cathartic emotional twist 5?